Now, I think it is quite amazing, actually, to think that we are talking today about an incident that actually took place 38 years ago. I know, and probably like many of you here, I actually have a sharper recollection of where I was on the day my Aunt Kitty's living room, watching the 6 o'clock news, when really the iconic images came through of what later we called the Bogside Massacre. 26 civil rights protesters gunned down by the British Army. And what was striking, I think, to all of us who saw those events was the ordinariness of the people involved. The fact that out of the 13 that died that day, 7 were teenage boys. And boys and protesters from one of the poorest parts of the island. Now, I know that everyone is going to enjoy this meeting, but I think I want you to join me in a very warm welcome to Eamonn as a source of thanks, really, because Eamonn and many others in the civil rights movement in Ireland have really been campaigning with such tenacity for 38 years to get the decision of the 15th of June, which was undoubtedly a victory for our side. So in the applause now for Eamonn and all of those, thank you very much for that.
Thanks very much. After that, I don't know about you, but I can't wait to hear what I have to say. So after the announcement of the findings of the Savile Tribunal, much of the commentary out of in the media, particularly in the British media, but also in the Irish media, had to do with the reception given by sort of the crowds gathered in Guildhall Square to David Cameron's speech, which was shown on a big screen, borrowed from Derry City Football Club, which we had erected at the front of the Guildhall building. And more than one commentator, Jon Snow on Channel 4, for example, said, wasn't it an amazing thing to hear sort of thousands of people from the Bogside cheering a British Prime Minister? This was a misunderstanding. The people in Guildhall Square did not learn the findings of the Savile Tribunal from David Cameron. Everybody in the square already knew the findings and had known for about 45 minutes. And that's quite simply because, although there was an embargo and the people inside the Guildhall were not supposed to leak any information out. Of course, information was leaking out of every window from the Guildhall in the forms of thumbs-up signs, but also direct contact, which we weren't supposed to have with the people outside. But they had arranged a little smoking area, sort of, and because of the law, you had to go outside the Guildhall building into this little sort of canvas hut, from which you could just shout across to people at the edges of the crowd. So they all knew what the result was. What they were cheering, what people were cheering, was not David Cameron. They were cheering what he had just said. Most of all, they were cheering the fact that we had forced him to say it. That wasn't a cheer for Cameron. It was a shout of triumph, really. That's what it was. And it was a shout of triumph because, after all these years, the British government have been forced to acknowledge the truth. That was the question, sort of in the minds of people, sort of before the 15th of June, if that was the date. Would they acknowledge the truth? Because a lot of unionist commentators in the years since the establishment of the Savile Tribunal had said, well, what's the point of spending all this money? What's the point of having all this time to produce a report when people have already made their minds up about what the truth is? That's absolutely true. People had already made their minds up. Nobody on the Bogside needed to be told what had happened on Bloody Sunday. Nobody needed to be told that the dead and the wounded were, without exception, innocent civilian people, most of them running away at the time when they had been shot. We knew that because we'd seen it. And I didn't need anybody to tell me what had happened on Bloody Sunday. I saw people being killed on Bloody Sunday. I saw it from the vantage point of lying on my stomach in the gutter, literally in Rossville Street, sort of craning my neck around to see what was happening. I didn't realise at the time that what was happening when people jumping over a little barricade would run a few steps and then arch and fall. And despite the fact that this was simultaneously with the crack of the paratroopers' rifles from the bottom of Rossville Street, it didn't occur to me at the time that what was happening was that they were being killed. The reason it didn't occur to me is that there was no reason for it. I couldn't understand, my mind couldn't encompass the fact that people were actually being shot dead, on our own streets, in the street where I was born. And because I had seen that, because I knew that they were innocent, I wasn't waiting for Lord Savill to tell me the truth. I wasn't waiting for the British government to tell me the truth. I was waiting to see whether they would acknowledge the truth. That was the point of the campaign. Could we force them to acknowledge the truth? And we did. In the half hour before we came out of the Guildhall, I was in the Guildhall for all sorts of reasons, with the families who had been admitted, about 200 members of the families in the end, out of it, because they were to be given prior access of a few hours to the report. I joined them about an hour and a half before the official announcement was made. And tell a little story about that, because it's interesting about what I'm going to come on to, that we had a statement prepared in advance to be read out, and the statement was one of triumph and one of vindication. It began by saying, "The victims of Bloody Sunday have been vindicated, the parachute regiment has been disgraced." Those were the first two sentences in it. We had no plan B. We knew that that's what was going to be found. Had Savill found differently, I'm not sure what we would have done. We'd have to sit down and craft a different statement. But here's what happened. In order to make sure, because we had changed the statement at the last, it was been changed all the time, over the week beforehand. As you might imagine, there was considerable negotiation as to what should be said. But we finally got the statement completed, and in order to make sure that everybody was happy with it, we didn't want a statement made on behalf of the families, and the families certainly didn't want a statement made on their behalf, which some of them might disagree with, or even disagree with the sentence in. So at the last minute we said, we better read this out to everybody, so that everybody's on side. And I read the statement out to the people in the hall, and asked for their approval. It was just met by a storm of applause, and everybody did approve it. But when we then left the main hall of the Guildhall, went out into the corridor to go down the stairs and out into Guildhall Square, I was confronted by a woman called Mary Madden. Mary Madden was the senior Northern Ireland Office official present. She was supervising the publication of the report in Derry. And she came up and stood right in front of me, quivering, and she said, "That will have to be changed." "What are you talking about?" She says, "That statement will have to be changed." "What are you talking about?" She said, "Everybody had agreed that this was to be a day of reconciliation." Now think of that formula. Everybody had agreed. It raises the question, who's everybody? Who had agreed that this was to be a day of reconciliation? And what a strange thing to say. This was a report on a massacre, mass murder carried out in Derry. And one of the peculiarities of the situation post-Savill is that it's been touted as an occasion when the British and Irish people, after 80 years or 300 years or 800 years or however you want to measure it, that this should be an occasion for reconciliation, not of guilt on one side and vindication on the other. And this has gone so far, in the weeks subsequent, that the publication of the Bloody Sunday report is being used in the Irish media and by quite a number of Irish politicians, including the government in Dublin, to suggest that this would be the perfect moment for Queen Elizabeth II to make the first visit by a British monarch to the Republic of Ireland since the establishment of the state. Almost certainly this is going to happen before the end of next year, as President Mary McAleese, who's the President of Ireland, has announced that she would like this visit now to take place before she leaves office at the end of next year. So before the end of the next year, Betty Windsor is going to waddle up O'Connell Street in Dublin, apparently, to the awed applause of the peasantry. It could happen, and there's a mystery here. How could Bloody Sunday and the Bloody Sunday report be the occasion for this? And the answer to this conundrum is to be found sort of in the bulk of the Savile Tribunal's report. Sort of it's famously 5,000 pages long. Of course, there was an executive summary, which is what everybody was working off in the first few hours after publication. It was about 60 pages long. And really, it wasn't until you were able to sit down in the days afterwards and begin to download sort of the report itself and read through it that you understood why David Cameron was able to make the statement that he did make, and why in the subsequent weeks, as I say, this has been touted sort of as an occasion for historic reconciliation. You see, the main message of the Savile report, of course, is one of huge triumph for the Bloody Sunday families and those who had campaigned alongside them. Sort of no sort of criticism or reservations about the rest of Savile's report can change that or subtract from it in any way. The day of the publication of the Savile report was literally one of the greatest days of my life. I mean, I had feelings sort of on that day that I don't think I've ever experienced before, and which I still don't fully understand. And everybody had that feeling, particularly inside the Guildhall. When I went in, as I say, about an hour and a half before a report was officially published, naturally, although I had every expectation of what it was going to say, sort of confidence in what it was going to say, I really wanted that confirmed. So when some of us would then be sprinted up the stairs of the Guildhall into the main hall where the families had gathered, sort of, and when I went into the hall, you didn't have to ask anybody, sort of, is it as good, sort of, as we hoped it was going to be from the family's point of view. The minute you walked into the hall, all you could see was people weeping, smiling, and a frenzy of hugs, which we were engulfed as soon as we went into the hall. And it was obvious that this wasn't just sort of a political moment, this was an emotional moment, sort of a moment of mass and communal emotion for everybody involved and everybody who was present. Sort of, although we were confident in the end of what the report was going to say, and the reason why we were confident is that it just wasn't possible for Savile to arrive at any other conclusion. It simply was not possible. When you read the evidence, and I sat through almost every day sort of the tribunal hearings, both in Derry and in London, and the reason why Savile found what he did is that he and these two fellow judges were compelled to find that on the basis of the evidence. But despite that, it had been a long, hard struggle. Been a long, hard struggle for 38 years. And in the beginning, although now sort of the government and the South and respectable politicians and the entire media in Britain and Ireland sang from the same hymn sheet in perfect harmony, welcoming the Savile report. It wasn't always like that in relation to Bloody Sunday. I can remember going to Dublin about 1990, I suppose, sort of with a delegation from the families, and we were going down to launch a book. Part of our propaganda effort was called Bloody Sunday in Derry, What Really Happened. And we launched the book in Dublin, a place called Buswell's Hotel, which is just across the street, across Kildare Street from Leinster House, from the Parliament in Dublin. And we invited, I think it was about 30 or 35 members of the Dublin Parliament to come and attend the launch of the book, to give it a bit of a propaganda boost and to try to make sure that it got into some of the Dublin newspapers. Only one TD turned up. He was an independent, the late Tony Gregory. Not a single member of a major party turned up. Around the same time, the families, again, just campaigning and trying to get publicity and trying to get backing, trying to mainstream the issue, sort of the need for the truth about Bloody Sunday. The previous president, the feisty, independent-minded feminist Mary Robinson, twice refused point blank to meet the Bloody Sunday families. She was tainted with provoism. Twice refused to meet them. She only, in the end, did meet them very briefly after a number of family members went down with placards and walked up and down for an afternoon outside her residence, or as in Uachtaráin in the Phoenix Park, demanding that she meet them. Then, a week after that, out of embarrassment, she agreed to meet them. The Catholic Primate of Ireland, Cardinal Daly, never met the Bloody Sunday families, refused over and over again to have a meeting with them, even after the former Bishop of Derry, Eddie Daly, who's a priest in that, iconic picture, sort of coming out of the bogside with the body of Jackie Duddy. Even after his intervention, the Cardinal wouldn't meet them. Not that I wanted to meet Cardinals any time about anything. I mean, I can live without ever meeting Cardinals, but it just nevertheless was interesting, so that he wouldn't actually meet the Bloody Sunday families. So the idea that this was always a sort of a mass campaign supported by the mainstream is simply not true. We were scorned and rejected, and also told over and over again that what the campaign was demanding was simply impossible, which on the face of it was. Because there, of course, had been a previous inquiry under the Tribunals of Evidence Act, which was a 1921 Act, and the basis for all such inquiries. There had been a previous inquiry, of course, under Lord Widgery back in 1972. He produced a report within 11 weeks of the event. You know, it was, I think, about 40 pages long, if you get it, but you could certainly read it in about an hour. If you sat down, of course, he found that all the soldiers were innocent and that the dead had nobody to blame but themselves because they had been rioters and gunmen and nail bombers, and anyway, the march was illegal and they shouldn't have been there in the first place. So the fact that Widgery had found that, and that finding had been accepted back in 1972 by the British Parliament, that meant that the official truth was set in stone. So on the face of it, it was simply impossible for us to get a second inquiry. So the winning of the inquiry, despite that, when Blair had to set aside all constitutional precedent and indeed constitutional rationality, and appoint the second inquiry, it was at that moment that suddenly the Bloody Sunday cause became very popular. You know, there still were some criticisms of it, of course, and a lot of criticisms of the length and the cost of the inquiry. And I'll just say a little bit about that. You know, why did Saville take so long? Why did he hear almost 1,000 witnesses? The reason why he had to hear all the witnesses and the reason why the inquiry took so long was very simple. It's because there were so many witnesses. Bloody Sunday was different from all the other atrocities that pockmark the history of 40 years of conflict in the North, in that it didn't happen on a lonely road in the dead of night. This wasn't a few people erupting into a pub, unexpectedly, massacring people and leaving immediately and fleeing the scene. Bloody Sunday was an atrocity which was played out over 8, 9, 10 minutes, in broad daylight on a crisp winter's afternoon in a built-up area where, because it was the culmination of a civil rights march, there were literally thousands of people in the vicinity. Every shooting and wounding on Bloody Sunday was witnessed by scores of people, some of them at very close quarters indeed. And they all had stories to tell, and they had to be allowed to give evidence. In other words, the main reason the inquiry took so long and therefore cost so much, the main reason, there were some others, the main reason had to do with the brazenness of the atrocity. The fact that these people were killing unarmed civilians, shooting them in the back in broad daylight, without a thought to who might see them, without a thought to what the consequences might be. See, and this is something which is not included in the Saville report. It's the point that I'm making. The brazenness of the atrocity is not included. Because had the brazenness of this been included in the report, had Saville found that and commented upon it, I don't think it would have been possible for David Cameron to make the speech that he did in the House of Commons. What is more, had Saville not confined guilt and responsibility for Bloody Sunday to a very small number of people, it wouldn't have been possible for Cameron to make the speech in the Commons that he made. And for this reason, for example, if you look at the evidence, as I've done over and over again, I can bore people for hours with the evidence to the Bloody Sunday Tribunal, I assure you. I try not to, but I could. If you read, when you get into the guts of a Saville's report, you find a number of very interesting things. You see, Saville finds that nobody apart from one platoon of the 1st Battalion of the Parachute Regiment, they're all privates and corporals, and one brigade commander of the 1st Battalion of the Paras, Lieutenant Colonel Derek Wilford, they were the guilty men, according to Saville. Now, this didn't matter. I'm not subtracting from the joy of the families in which I shared. I'm not suggesting for a moment that ought to have been tinged with any reservation. Find that I'm making, when you look at the report closely, what it does is insulate the British Army itself, and indeed the Parachute Regiment itself, and certainly the British government and British civil servants and the entire British establishment. It insulates all them from any blame for Bloody Sunday. And I don't think that's really sustainable on the basis of the evidence, indeed on the basis of common sense. You see, I could select just a couple of people who might have been, there are others, who might have been they're burdened with some responsibility for Bloody Sunday. You take Major General Robert Ford. Major Ford was the commander of land forces in Northern Ireland at the time, second in command of all the army to Harry Tuzo, who was the general officer commanding. Number 2 was Robert Ford. Now, Robert Ford was the guy who sent the Paras to Derry. Paras weren't stationed in Derry. They were brought from Belfast, where they were the reserve battalion in Belfast. Belfast Brigade was commanded by a man called Frank Kitson. Sort of the name sort of will ring a bell with some of the more gnarled and grizzled comrades here present. Frank Kitson's the man who wrote a book in the 1960s called Low Intensity Operations, which is the manual for counterinsurgency still being used by British forces. He gathered his expertise in Malaya. Then Frank Kitson was a hard man, sort of the soldiers used to say. And he had the Paras as his reserve battalion in Belfast. He and Ford between them, at Ford's instigation, sort of detached the Paras from Belfast and sent them to Derry. You see, and Saville says in his report explicitly that Ford could not have foreseen what was going to happen in the Bogside when he brought the Paras in. He says that absolutely explicitly, that General Ford, the fact that he brought the Paras to Derry, it doesn't mean he was in any way responsible. Now, this is quite simply untrue. It was foreseeable what the Paras were going to do in Derry. We know it was foreseeable because it was foreseen. It was foreseen by the Chief of Police in Derry, District Inspector Frank Lagan, who said repeatedly in the days leading up to Bloody Sunday to British Army officers, don't do this. He described it as madness. Moments before the Paras were actually sent into the Bogside, he was in the British Army headquarters, which is called Ebrington Barracks, about 2 miles away, standing alongside the commander of the 8th Brigade, man who's in overall charge in Derry, Pat McClellan, and he said to him, for God's sake, hold them, for God's sake, hold them, as the order was about to be given, an indication given, some dubiety or doubt about what the nature of the order was, which needn't concern us for the moment. So the Chief of Police knew. Not only did the Chief of Police know, garrison commanders in Derry knew and protested very vigorously. You know, and sometimes when you look over sort of the whole history of Bloody Sunday, there are a number of British Army officers who don't come out of it too badly at all. And one of them is Peter Welsh. Peter Welsh was the commander of the 2nd Anglians, had been garrisoned in Derry, been in Derry for 18 months. And when he heard that the Paras were being sent to Derry on the Thursday before Bloody Sunday, Wednesday or the Thursday, I forget which, he went to McClellan, the brigade commander in Derry, and protested and said, you can't allow this to happen. And McClellan told him, well, you know, there's nothing I can do about it. The orders have come from above. Peter Welsh said to him, well, and Peter Welsh said all this to the tribunal. He gave all this evidence. Saville knew all this. Peter Welsh said to him, well, I'm going to protest to Lisburn. Lisburn was the headquarters, Army headquarters, Northern Ireland, only to be told by McClellan, that will do you no good. This order came from higher up. Now, higher up had to mean Whitehall. It had to mean from the highest levels sort of in the British Army, if headquarters Northern Ireland were not involved, if the order had come from higher up, or at least, as we discovered after, explicit sanction for sending the Paras to Derry, that if it come from higher up. Welsh obviously felt very strongly about this, because what he did next is that he phoned an old friend who had been at military college with him, a man called Sir David Ramsbottom. If the name rings a bell, it's because David Ramsbottom was subsequently Her Majesty's Inspector of Prisons. You might remember he was sacked by Jack Straw for taking the job seriously, sort of, and saying that the prisons were in a terrible mess. And if you're sacked by Jack Straw, there has to be good in you somewhere. You know, it seems to me. Ramsbottom at the time was the personal assistant, aide de camp, or however you pronounce it, to the general officer command, the chief of the general staff of the British Army, Field Marshal Sir Michael Carver. And he was his personal assistant. Welsh knew him personally, so he phoned him. Ramsbottom described all this in detail in his statement to the tribunal and said to them, look, will you please intervene with Carver, with the chief of the general staff, and tell him that there's madness going on here in Derry. They're bringing the Paras to police a civil rights demonstration in this town in a few days' time. That message was given to Carver on the Friday morning before Bloody Sunday, and minutes before Carver went into a meeting of Edward Heath's cabinet. Ramsbottom said afterwards that he had no doubt that Carver would have said this to the cabinet. They knew not just that there was a possibility of massacre in Derry, but that very senior British Army officers felt very strongly about the ill-advisability, to put it mildly, of sending the powers to Derry, and yet nobody intervened. So, see, and yet Saville makes no finding about that at all. Indeed, Saville says that the entire government and political establishment, both in London and in Belfast, couldn't have foreseen what had happened and bear no responsibility at all for the events. You see, as Saville had found differently, had he said even that this was a serious error of judgment, or had he said sort of something stronger than that, could David Cameron have stood up in the Commons and said, the British Army's been vindicated, this was just a few bad apples, and basically that's the finding, it's the bad apple theory applied to Bloody Sunday. Could he have said that? If Saville had criticised the commander of land forces in Northern Ireland and above, David Cameron couldn't have said, as he did say in that speech, that the British Army is still the finest army in the world and that its reputation is not at all besmirched by the disgraceful actions of the small number of people, a bunch of squaddies and one undisciplined battalion commander. If Saville hadn't said that they did it all, Cameron couldn't have made that speech, and people couldn't have said afterwards, well, you know, the British government has owned up to everything, so now let's be reconciled after 800 years of misunderstanding and strife. Couldn't have said that. Nobody could have said that. Take another guy who was in Derry on Bloody Sunday. Lieutenant Colonel Wilford's second in command, man called Captain Michael Jackson. He was 26 at the time of Bloody Sunday. Now, Jackson was on the ground in Rossville Street in Derry when the shooting took place. All around him, there were rifles being fired, there were soldiers aiming at targets, there were people falling down, there were screams, shouts, and all the rest of it. In a statement to the tribunal, Jackson either couldn't remember any of this or said that he didn't see any of it. He saw nothing. Jackson saw nothing happening all around him, but he did have a decisive role to play in the Bloody Sunday story. Because when we were over in London, down in the Central Hall in Westminster, listening to the military evidence, we had to come over to London because the soldiers said it would be too dangerous for them to go to Derry. Well, maybe so. So they moved the entire tribunal over to London at the cost of over 20 million quid. Another explanation, another part of the explanation for the length and the cost of the inquiry. Jackson gave evidence in April 2003 to the inquiry. In it, he said he didn't see anything, couldn't really help the tribunal, memory very hazy, didn't think he noticed anything anyway when it was going on. He finished his evidence, wasn't very interesting or controversial, scarcely reported. A couple of weeks later, Major Ted Loudon appeared to give evidence. Now, Major Ted was handed on the witness stand, one of the family's lawyers handed him a shot list, that's what it was called, Loudon's list, Loudon's shot list. And this was a document, typewritten document, which purported to describe every shot fired by the soldiers on Bloody Sunday and the effect of the shot and why it had been fired. It was using sort of a six-figure map references. There was the soldier, there was the target, each target identified, rifleman, man with a pistol, man with a nail bomb, man with a petrol bomb, etc., etc. That was all in the shot list. There were 15 separate engagements, as it was called. And the story was that that is what happened on Bloody Sunday. That's the story that came out immediately afterwards. And then something very strange happened. Loudon was giving evidence over 2 days. And the next morning, as soon as the tribunal opened, Saville's lead QC, a man called Christopher Clark, now a High Court judge, Christopher Clark handed Loudon another shot list. This one was handwritten. It was the typewritten one in script, in handwriting. And he says, that's the same document, isn't it? And it was literally word for word, map reference by map reference, exactly the same as the typewritten one. And Clark said to him, that's your handwriting, isn't it? And Loudon said, no, that's not my handwriting. That's Captain Jackson's handwriting. Mystery. How on earth did that happen? And Loudon said, well, you know, what must have happened is that I wrote it out, and then Captain Jackson must have taken sort of my notes and written it out again, word for word, because it was the same as the typewritten one, word for word written out. And Clark said, well, why on earth would he do that? And Loudon said, well, you better ask him, I have no idea. There's this mystery sort of this. And Loudon had described, you see, in great detail how this list had been compiled. He said that he had sat in the back of an armoured personnel carrier, like the little sort of makeshift headquarters that the Powers had set up in a place called Clarence Avenue, just outside the Bogside. And he described these soldiers one by one being brought to him. What did you do? I fired so many shots. Where were you? Identified on the map, and so forth. But this was in Jackson's handwriting, it turned out. Then something else amazing sort of was revealed. There were 5 other documents in Michael Jackson's handwriting. These 5 other documents were the personal accounts of what they had seen and what they had experienced on Bloody Sunday of the aforementioned Lieutenant Colonel Derek Wolford, commander of the Paras, all 3 company commanders who had been present in Derry on the day, and the brigade intelligence officer. 5 personal statements, all in Michael Jackson's handwriting. Asked about this, Jackson said he couldn't remember doing it. He couldn't remember why he had done it. He couldn't remember who had told him to do this. Yet, think about it, all this was done, incidentally, before the morning after Bloody Sunday. It was done during the night. Now, you would think you'd remember that, wouldn't you? If you had sat there in this bizarre exercise. And needless to say, all these accounts exonerated all the soldiers and identified everybody hit by bullets as having been armed with some potentially lethal device. So Jackson did all that, and yet Saville makes no finding against him at all. He says more or less in his report, it's a bit of a mystery, all that business about Captain Jackson, sort of, and all this scribbling that he was doing. He also says that no evidence that this shot list was used in any way as part of a cover-up of what had happened on Bloody Sunday. But you see, if you read the preceding pages, before he arrives at this conclusion, Saville reports, as a fact, that this shot list was used early in the morning after Bloody Sunday in an interview on the BBC World Service Radio by a man called Colonel Harry Dalzell Payne. He was the head of information policy, i.e. propaganda, in Northern Ireland at the time. He gave an interview to the BBC immediately after Bloody Sunday, using the shot list and saying, here's what happened on Bloody Sunday. And that went out around the world. And the next, early in the daylight hours after that, British Information Services, which is the government's propaganda arm, I suppose, distributed the shot list and a commentary on it to every British embassy and consulate in the world, saying, this is the answer to any questions that might come up about what happened in Derry yesterday. Saville reports that. He also reports that the shot list was the basis of the first statement made in the House of Commons about Bloody Sunday by Lord Balneil, the Defence Minister, Minister for the Army. Lord, but he was an MP. I don't know how that happened, sort of some constitutional nonsense. You have lords in the House of Commons. But anyway, Balneil used this shot list and read it out, not word for word, but used it as the basis for his statement in the Commons. And after all that, Saville says there's no evidence that this shot list was used as a cover-up. Now I would say that is the cover-up. That is the cover-up. And that's the use of the shot list. Now this is an amazing finding. You see, and the point about it is that, Michael Jackson, another odd thing too about the responsibility for Bloody Sunday and who's blamed for it, there's the battalion commander, Wilford. He's just trashed and ruined in the report. Undisciplined, disobeyed orders, had no control over his men, blah, blah, blah. Immediately under him, there's Captain Michael Jackson. He gets no responsibility at all, no blame at all. Then under Jackson, there's the squaddies who did the actual shooting, and they're all blamed. But in the middle, in between them, there's Michael Jackson, the man who wrote all these things out. And Saville hasn't a bad word to say about him. Now, the significance of Jackson is this, is that Jackson, you see, didn't suffer in his career the way Wilford did, as a result of, Wilford never rose above. He was in his 20s on Bloody Sunday, never made any higher grade than Lieutenant Colonel. The Brits knew sort of what had happened, and Wilford had already been selected as the scapegoat many, many years ago. But Colonel Michael Jackson, although he was only second in command of a brigade at the time, subsequently rose rapidly in the ranks. Michael Jackson, in 2003, the year he gave evidence down in Central Hall, finally made it to the very top. He became the Chief of the General Staff. He became Britain's top soldier. Now, if Saville had found that Britain's top soldier was up to his neck in Bloody Sunday, up to his neck in the lying and the cover-up about Bloody Sunday, could David Cameron have said, this report does not reflect badly sort of on the British Army as a whole? He couldn't have said that. In other words, if the report facilitated them saying that. I want to another thing that's not mentioned in the report. Saville says explicitly that there was no culture of tolerance of improper violence by British soldiers in Northern Ireland, which the Paras might have interpreted as giving them the green light to do what they did on the Bogside. No evidence of that. Now the Paras themselves, the same Paras, the previous August, over the 9th, 10th and 11th of August in Ballymurphy in West Belfast. Jerry Conlon referred to this in his, when he was talking yesterday. Killed 11 people, including 2 priests and 3 women. Many of them shot in the back from the roof of, I think, of the Henry Taggart Memorial Hall, where they were sitting, taking pot shots at people. Killed 11 people. That was the Paris. The newspapers in Northern Ireland, particularly the nationalist newspapers, were filled day after day with people complaining about being badly treated, being roughed up, people being shot and killed by British soldiers. In July 1971, right on the place where Bloody Sunday took place, there were 2 young men, Cusick and Beattie, Desi Beattie and Seamus Cusick, shot dead by the British Army. This was happening over and over again. It was quite nice. And Saville says there's no evidence of a culture of tolerance, of violence, which might have led the Paris to believe that they'd get away with what they did in Derry. Of course they believed they would get away with it. Not only from their general experience around the world as the frontline assassins for the British elite, not only because of that, because they had just gotten away with it in Ballymurphy a couple of months earlier. That would have been in their minds, of course. And, of course, what happened in Derry then, and the fact that they appeared to have gotten away with it in Derry, justified them going on and wreaking further violence and further murder on people in Northern Ireland. In September 1972, the same soldiers, not just the same battalion and the same company and the same platoon, the same soldiers. One of them, Soldier F, the other soldier 027. Those 2 soldiers murdered 2 men on the Shankill Road in Belfast in the first week of September 1972. And if you read the inquest papers on those 2 men, Richie McKinney and Robert Johnson. Robert Johnson had come out of a bar called the Wee House in Manor Street in the Shankill Road, which, as some of you know, is the heartland of loyalist Belfast. And he's a bit of a derelict. He's a local character and the worse for drink and the rest of it. And he came out, and civilians who gave evidence at his inquest said he was shouting things like, I walked these streets in my bare feet in the 30s. And he shouted things like, the meek shall inherit the earth. Bit crazy in the drink and so forth. And Soldier F, who killed 4 people at least on Bloody Sunday, took aim and shot him dead. And in giving evidence to the inquest, in writing, of course, he didn't actually appear, they never did in those days. Soldier F said, I saw this man, he came round the corner, he had an object in his hand, I took it to be a rifle, he seemed to be pointing it at me, in self-defense I opened fire. Exactly what they said in the Bogside. He's saying one thing leads to another. The culture of tolerant violence gives them to believe that they can do all this with impunity. And yet Saville says that he found no evidence of any such culture. In a way, sort of in a very narrow way, you can see what Saville meant. Because Saville had decided at an early stage in his hearings that he wasn't going to consider what had happened in Ballymurphy. He wasn't going to consider other incidents, and the fairly reasonable grounds that if he did start to consider them, he'd have to investigate those incidents with the same detail as he was investigating Bloody Sunday itself. And says it's not practical, and maybe it wasn't. But having decided not to collect that evidence, what sense did it make to say in the body of his report that there was no evidence? The most he was entitled to say, and this would have been stretching it, the most he was entitled to say is that there might have been evidence and there might not have been evidence, but since he, for practical reasons, didn't seek the evidence, he couldn't make any finding about that culture at all. Yet he said there's no culture of the toleration of violence. Had he found that there was, could David Cameron have made that speech? Could he have said that there was no responsibility on the British Army as a corporate entity for what had happened on Bloody Sunday, and the British political establishment really it didn't have to shoulder any portion of the blame at all? You see, and the report, Saville's report, was brilliant for the Bloody Sunday families. Absolutely brilliant. Found that all their people were innocent. And that's the main thing, of course, from the point of view of the families and point of view of Derry and all the rest. A brilliant report for the Bloody Sunday families. Not a bad report for the British Army either. You see, and the question would arise really, well, how did that come about? Is Saville a liar? And his fellow judges? Did you do this deliberately? Sort of as a small part of the cover-up as well. I don't think so. I actually think of what happened, and this is actually more telling in a way if I'm right about this, and it has to be speculation, because how would I know what's going on in the minds of you, particularly about Captain, later General Michael Jackson, Sir Michael Jackson. They just knew he's the chief of the general staff. You don't go there. We don't go there. That's, I believe, is what happened. The mindset simply excluded all that. But of course, we don't have to have that mindset. We don't have to exclude it. When we look sort of at the Bloody Sunday report, sort of what we can see sort of is a very cleverly crafted, highly sophisticated version of the Widgery report. It is another British establishment report exculpating sort of the British establishment itself from all responsibility and thus opening up sort of the opportunities for various of the great and the good, including incidentally the American ambassador, a man called Sussman, I forget his first name. He said last week, welcoming the report, and he said that he talked to Barack Obama about it. And he and Barack sort of were delighted with this report and delighted, again, with the opportunities it opened up for reconciliation. Great thing, this reconciliation. You see, and the other thing you got to look at, sort of in relation to Bloody Sunday, is that not many people in Ireland, this is very important to the way the report has been received elsewhere, not very many people in Ireland are of a mind to make these sort of points or to make this analysis. When you say it quietly and carefully to members of the Bloody Sunday family and others, everybody knows that this is a very flawed report and flawed in the ways that I've just seen. But to make the point just seems to be raining on the parade. You know, it does seem to be a bit begrudging sort of about the joy of the families. And it's not intended in that way at all. As I said, sort of I share fully sort of in the joy of the families. Yet, but politically, these are the main points, it seems to me, that need to be made about the Savile inquiry. And what it shows really is that even after 38 years of campaigning, even after what was, sort of on the face of it, a huge triumph for ordinary people fighting against all the odds, still they won't come clean. Still, the British establishment, the British ruling class, won't come clean about what their role in Ireland was. You see, because the other really distinctive thing, and I'll end with this, sort of about a Bloody Sunday, and what made it different to other atrocities, was that this was an atrocity which can't really sort of be fitted into the preferred narrative of Northern Ireland. The preferred narrative, preferred sort of by establishment people everywhere, and particularly by the Irish and British ruling classes. It says that the conflict in Northern Ireland really was about two irrational communities locked in a bizarre conflict about religious and political identity dating back centuries. Sort of a conflict which had nothing to do with Britain, nothing to do with any outside force, self-generated from within this peculiar territory of Northern Ireland. You see, Bloody Sunday wasn't perpetrated by people representing or purporting to represent one community upon people from the other community. Bloody Sunday was perpetrated by the British Army. It doesn't fit into the narrative. You see, and when Cameron and people talk about reconciliation between the British and Irish people, they also have in mind, and this is said over and over again explicitly in Northern Ireland, there should be the occasion for reconciliation between the fractious Catholic and Protestant communities in Northern Ireland. Now, I don't need David Cameron or the American ambassador or Lord Savile or anybody else to reconcile me to my Protestant neighbours. I've never needed that. I've always held, sort of a socialist down through the years have held, sort of that the working class in Northern Ireland has a common identity and a common interest which, despite history, transcends and will in the end, in practical terms, transcend sort of the artificial differences between us. I didn't need his advice to do that. And I must say, I deeply resented being told by a British Conservative Prime Minister that the time had come for me to put my hatreds in the past. And the other thing is this. You see, not only did I not need that advice about reconciliation, neither did tens, hundreds of thousands of Protestant people in Northern Ireland. There wasn't a great outburst sort of anti-Catholic feeling when Savile and begrudgery when Savile's report was published. On the contrary, all the indications are that the majority of Protestant people in Northern Ireland felt for the Bloody Sunday families, had come to realise the truth of what had happened on Bloody Sunday, and recognised that it was indefensible insofar as reconciliation was one of the results of the Bloody Sunday report. It had nothing to do sort of with the advice, the clearing of the British establishment and the things that David Cameron welcomed. It had to do with the dawning realisation that we do have more in common with one another than we have to divide us. Within minutes of the report being officially published, I had a text from a man called Davy Nicol. Davy Nicol will be known to some people from the north of Ireland. Davy became well known in Northern Ireland as a leader of the Ulster Defence Association, a Protestant paramilitary terrorist group. He's mellowed a bit, so he tells me, sort of in the subsequent years, as so many people. But I got a text from Davy immediately afterwards. It said, "Congratulations, we shall overcome." Davy Nicol. There's reconciliation for you. There's reconciliation. Long before Cameron had uttered his speech. So, all I'm saying is this really, that we should share in the joy of the Bloody Sunday families. We should welcome. It's always good to win one.
Yeah.
It's always good to fucking win one, particularly at the moment, and on the main issue, we won that one. Oh, and incidentally, and I say this, sorry, we've gone about, but something has just struck me. The week before the Bloody Sunday report came out, we had the result of the second Raytheon trial in Derry.
Yes.
Which 9 women who had occupied it. Where's Goretti's down there? My partner was one of them. 2 of the members of the SWP in Derry had been acquitted. And we know that from that occupation took place during the assault on Gaza last year. And we know from internal papers that we got under the Freedom of Information Act that it was that occupation by the 9 Raytheon women which caused Raytheon, a global company, the turnover last year of $22 billion, 70,000 employees in 40 countries. They got out of Derry because of the Raytheon woman. We got rid of them. And talking of victories, one thing reminds me of another. Talking of victories, I shouldn't mention the Raytheon a victory without mentioning the EDO decommissioners in Brighton who were found innocent last Friday of their occupation on the same occasion of an arms factory. That's, of course, got nothing to do with Bloody Sunday. Although if I was given 5 minutes, I could construct an argument which would connect the two together. So I just mention it and say, Bloody Sunday report, we should note the politics of it. Note the politics of it. We should welcome the great triumph of the campaign, the inspiration that it gives to us, the people all over the world. And in that statement read out by Tony Doherty outside the Guildhall, he said that we, at this moment, our minds are with those around the world who have been the victims of unaccountable power and who will never get an inquiry and might never have the truth acknowledged. And he mentioned the people of Grozny, the people of Fallujah, the people of Gaza, Sharpeville, and the rest of it. And he said, let our truth stand for their truth too. The lessons of Bloody Sunday do not have to do with reconciliation between Britain and Ireland. They have to do with the indomitable determination of ordinary people to fight on for truth and justice, even when they are told that this is utterly impossible. We can win because the Bloody Sunday people won, because the Raytheon people won, because the Brighton campaigners won in their campaign against the arms trade. We can all take heart from that. It's not a question simply of taking satisfaction out of the result of the Bloody Sunday inquiry. What we've got to do is to take it within ourselves and allow it to focus and fuel our enthusiasm for continuing the fight against injustice. If we do that, we will have truly vindicated the dead of Bloody Sunday. Thank you.